I used to work at a small convenience store connected to a gas station. This happened right at the start of February, right after the holiday season. Around here, the temperatures drop to brutal levels during this time. That night, I was working a late shift, though not an overnight one. I think I was scheduled to be there until around 2:30 a.m. or so. The snow was coming down lightly, but the wind was strong, making it feel like it was close to 15 degrees outside. Even stepping outside for a few minutes was unbearable. Hardly anyone came through that night. At around midnight, a man walked into the store, making me jump a little because I hadn't heard a vehicle pull up. He didn't move further inside but just stood near the entrance. I greeted him, and he responded with a nod and a slight smile before turning to stare out the glass door. My eyes followed his, and I realized there were no cars outside. He must have walked here. "How's it going tonight, sir?" I asked just to break the silence. He glanced at me and said he was all right, explaining that he was just waiting inside for his ride to arrive. I told him it was fine and that he could stay as long as he needed. I didn't completely understand his situation, but I went back to restocking shelves and tidying up the store. An hour passed, and the man was still standing there, waiting. I asked if he wanted to use the store phone to call someone, but he declined and continued to wait. It was weird. The weather was bad. Sure, but waiting for that long without a call or update seemed odd. Even the fact that he had walked here in this cold was strange. Where had he even come from? I went behind the counter and stood there, unsure of what else to say. Another half hour passed as I spaced out, occasionally glancing at my phone, when suddenly, the man straightened up a little and turned his eyes toward me. There was something unsettling about his gaze. His expression seemed empty, sent a shiver through me. I was about to ask if he was okay when a pair of headlights appeared outside. A car pulled up close to the door and parked, but nobody got out. I looked back at the man. He was still staring at me before he turned and stepped outside. The driver rolled down the window, and instead of getting in, the two of them started talking. Something about it didn't sit right with me. The way they were speaking, it felt like they were planning something. I wasn't going to take any chances. I quickly stepped around the counter and walked to the entrance, locking the door behind him. The man instantly turned his head toward me, his eyes full of anger. He rushed to the door and yanked at the handle, trying to force it open. The driver got out and did the same, both of them trying to get inside. They were furious. I sprinted back behind the counter and grabbed the phone, calling the police while keeping my eyes on them. I was just praying they didn't have anything to break the glass with. Thankfully, the moment they saw me making the call, they jumped into the car and sped off. It was obvious they had been planning something. What exactly, I'll never know. They were never caught. I'm a 30-year-old guy, and I live in a small home in an average neighborhood. The town I live in is on the outskirts of a massive forest that stretches for hundreds of miles. I like to take walks along some of the smaller trails that run close to my backyard, though I usually don't have time until later at night. I never really minded, though. I just wear a headlamp and enjoy the trails to myself. On this particular night, it wasn't too chilly, so around 8:30, I grabbed my jacket and headed out. The air was still and quiet as usual, but as I walked deeper in, I thought I heard something. I stopped and looked out into the trees. There was someone there. They looked like a child. It was too dark and they were too far away for me to see clearly, but they couldn't have been older than 9 or 10. And they were alone. Even though I walked this trail often, I had never ventured beyond it. The forest beyond was unmarked, and I knew I could get lost within minutes. That made me even more concerned for this kid. "Are you okay? The trail back is over here," I called out. The child didn't move. I stepped forward into the woods, calling out again. I wasn't sure what to do. Go in to help them or turn back and call for someone. If I left, the chances of anyone else finding them later would only get worse. So I moved closer, urging them to follow me out. But instead of coming toward me, the kids started backing up. Not like they were afraid, but almost as if they were deliberately staying within sight, leading me further into the woods. At the time, I was too focused on helping to realize it. I just kept following. For a few minutes, I walked deeper and deeper into unfamiliar forest territory until the kid suddenly disappeared behind something. A structure. It looked like an old, rundown shed. Small, weathered, and completely out of place in the middle of the woods. I assumed the kid had gone inside, but before I could check, I heard something. Footsteps. Heavy ones. Someone much bigger than a child. My stomach dropped. A sickening realization hit me. This felt like a setup. I immediately switched off my headlamp and bolted back the way I came. I ran until I reached the trail, then sprinted straight home and called the police. They told me there were no reports of a missing child, but an officer came by and walked the trail with me. When we reached the shed, there was no one there. For a while, nothing happened, and I figured that was the end of it. But a few weeks later, the city went out to tear down the shed. It wasn't supposed to be on public forest land, and apparently they found something. I don't know what it was, only that it was connected to some kind of kidnapping case. They never gave full details, and a lot of the information was kept private. I don't know who that kid was. I don't know who was out there with them, but I can't stop thinking about it. Was it really a trap? Maybe I'm just overthinking it, but some part of me feels like it was something else, like a vision or a sign leading me to whatever was happening out there. I knew there was a brutal snowstorm happening that night. I had actually called off work just to avoid the danger of driving in it. The snowfall was so heavy that I could barely see a few feet ahead. Everything was completely obscured by the swirling snow, so I stayed inside all day. Something about the freezing weather made me want to curl up on the couch at night and drift off while watching TV. I don't even remember exactly when I fell asleep, but I think it was pretty early, maybe around 8 or 9. I woke up suddenly to the sound of someone coughing, just a single cough. Since I had been asleep, I couldn't tell where it had come from or how far away it was. But the first thing I noticed was how pitch black everything was. There wasn't a single light on. I must have been out for hours. Then it hit me. The sound had come from just outside my front door. At this hour, during a blizzard, I stood up and peeked out the window, but all I could see was a wall of white, nothing else. I was confused. Had I actually heard something? Or was it one of those realistic dreams that feel like real life? Shaking my head, I turned back toward the couch, but out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something moving down the hallway. My pulse quickened. I flipped on the light and stared down the hall. "Is someone there?" I asked, my voice unsteady. A wave of adrenaline rushed through me. I wasn't sure what I had seen, but I suddenly felt trapped. I couldn't go outside, the storm was too dangerous. That meant if someone really was in here, I was stuck with them. I cautiously walked down the hall, but just before I reached the end, there was a rapid series of thumping sounds, followed by a powerful gust of wind tearing into the house. I spun around the corner. One of the windows at the far end of the room was wide open. Someone had just escaped through it. For a brief moment, I froze. Then my body kicked into action. I rushed over, slammed the window shut, and grabbed my phone to call the police. By the time they arrived, the snow had already erased any trace of the intruder. There was no way to know who they were or what they had been doing in my home. I was at home, thinking it was just an ordinary evening. It was the middle of winter, and snow was falling outside. After getting back from work, I made myself dinner and went to bed. But in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound. A deep, groaning creak, like an old wooden floorboard shifting or maybe something on the roof. It was loud enough to make me think there might be a leak in the ceiling. I wasn't too worried, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep unless I checked. I got up, leaving the lights off so I wouldn't fully wake myself. Moving lazily, I stepped into the hallway and opened the spare room. It was packed with exercise equipment. I looked up at the ceiling, but there was no sign of water damage. Everything seemed dry. I also couldn't hear any strong wind outside. Curious if it was still snowing, I wandered over to the window and pulled the curtains aside. The snow was still coming down, but lightly. Maybe I had imagined how loud the sound had been. Still, since I was already up, I decided to check the other room as well. I walked over, pushed the door open, and glanced up at the ceiling again. Nothing looked out of place. But as I took a step forward, I felt something cold and wet under my foot. The carpet had a damp patch, like water had been spilled on it. I instinctively looked up again, expecting to see a leak, but there was nothing there. I flipped on the light and now I could see it clearly. Several damp spots trailing across the floor, forming a line from the window to the door. My stomach tightened. I stepped back into the hallway and saw that the wet spots continued, leading straight toward my bedroom. My pulse pounded in my ears. I glanced toward my room and froze when I saw the spots go even further inside. I didn't wait to see more. Rushing to the kitchen, I grabbed my keys and bolted out. By the time the police arrived to check the house, there was no one there. Maybe whoever it was had already left before I even woke up. Even now, the thought that someone might have been in my room while I slept unsettles me. It didn't seem likely that I had walked over the wet spots when I first left my bedroom, so maybe they had sneaked in while I was distracted in the other room. But somehow that thought wasn't any more comforting. That creaking noise, it must have been them climbing in through the window. Or maybe it was them leaving. Whatever the case, whatever could have happened that night, I guess I'll never know. I was driving back from my job, and it was snowing. Not a blizzard, but enough to make me slow down and be extra cautious. The air was bitterly cold, definitely below freezing. I had to stay late at work that night, probably until around 1 or 2 in the morning. The streets were empty, no other cars in sight. As I pulled up to a red light at an intersection, I stopped even though there wasn't a single vehicle around. I sat there, exhausted, just thinking about how much I wanted to get home and sleep. Suddenly, there was a loud knock against my truck. I flinched and immediately turned my head toward the passenger side window. A woman was standing there. I had no clue where she had come from, but she was knocking and staring right at me. I hesitated, then rolled the window down slightly. She looked young, maybe in her late 20s, and her face was pale from the cold. She apologized and said she didn't mean to be a bother, but her car had broken down about a mile back. She had tried walking home but hadn't realized just how freezing it was. She asked if I could give her a ride, saying her house was just a mile farther down this road. I felt bad for her. Maybe it was the way she spoke, or maybe it was just the fact that she looked so cold, but I believed her. It was brutal outside, and I didn't want to leave her stranded, so I agreed and unlocked the door. She climbed in and kept thanking me over and over as I started driving. A couple of minutes later, she told me to turn into a neighborhood. I passed by this area every day on my way to work, but I had never actually driven through it. As soon as I turned in, I could tell this wasn't the best part of town. The houses were tiny, old, and run down, almost like mobile homes packed closely together. I kept driving, but the road hadn't been plowed yet, and as I went farther in, the snow got worse. My truck began struggling to push through, so I slowed down and asked her if this was a good place for her to get out. When I turned to look at her, she had a strange, almost disappointed expression on her face. The second she noticed me looking, though, she forced a smile and politely asked if I could keep going a little further. Something felt off. I hesitated, and she asked again, this time in a less friendly tone. I told her I didn't want to risk getting my truck stuck back there, but she kept pushing, trying to guilt me into it. After a few moments, I had enough. I firmly told her no and that she needed to get out. Her expression changed to something close to anger, but she said nothing. She just opened the door and stepped out. I thought it was odd that she was reacting this way, especially after I had gone out of my way to help her. I started making a 3-point turn to head back, and as my headlights swung around, they lit up an area near the houses. That's when I saw them. A group of people was standing farther back near the tree line, right in the direction the woman was walking toward. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching. They were exactly where she had been trying to get me to go. I didn't wait around to figure out what was going on. I finished my turn as fast as I could and got the hell out of there. I don't know what I almost walked into that night, but I'm certain it wouldn't have been good. If I had kept driving forward, or worse, if my truck had gotten stuck in that snow, I don't even want to think about what might have happened. I was staying at a lodge in a fairly remote town near a ski resort I visit every winter. The resort itself was way too pricey to stay at, so plenty of people opted for these lodges instead. Anyway, this was just a few days into my trip. I had spent the entire day skiing and got back to the lodge around 7 p.m. I cut the day short because once the sun dipped below the horizon, the cold really started to bite. After taking a hot shower and having dinner, I settled by the fireplace to relax for the night. That's when I heard footsteps crunching through the snow. They stopped right at my door. As I got up to see who it was, I noticed something strange. They didn't knock. I froze halfway to the door, waiting. A few seconds passed, and then finally, a knock came. Cautiously, I stepped forward and cracked the door open. Since this wasn't my place, I felt some weird obligation to at least see who it was. A man stood there, probably in his late 30s, with dark hair and a thick beard. He flinched slightly when I opened the door, but the reaction seemed delayed, almost unnatural, like he was pretending to be startled. I couldn't really explain why, but it felt off. "Can I help you?" I asked. The man smiled and asked who I was. Instead of answering, I asked him the same thing. He claimed he had reserved the lodge for the night. I told him that couldn't be right and asked if he had a confirmation email or anything to show. He fumbled for an excuse. At that point, things felt off. I knew for a fact that I had booked this lodge for the entire week, so I just said, "Sorry, but I think there's been a mistake," and started closing the door. That's when he put his hand against it, stopping me. "Mind if I step inside for a moment while I figure this out? Just to warm up." His smile returned, but it felt forced. Maybe I was being cold, but something about him made me deeply uneasy. I told him, "Sorry, I can't help you," and firmly shut the door. I stood there listening. He didn't move at first, just stood there for what felt like 30 seconds. Then, at last, I heard footsteps retreating through the snow. That was bizarre, but I figured if there really was a mix-up, the property owners would contact me. I sat back down, turned on the TV, and let some random show play at low volume. Scrolling on my phone, snacking, I was just enjoying my evening. Couple of hours passed. I was getting really tired, but then, out of nowhere, that guy popped back into my head. I wasn't sure why, but something about the whole thing didn't sit right with me. I got up and went back to the door. Peering out, I saw the snow-covered landscape, the darkness making everything look even colder. But then I spotted something else. A figure, standing just beyond the trees. I couldn't be sure if it was the same man, but I had no reason to think it wasn't. My gut twisted. I went straight to the couch and called the company that managed the lodges. They wasted no time calling the police. Surprisingly, officers arrived fairly quickly, walking up the snowy path toward my lodge. The man saw them too, but he didn't get a chance to slip away. When they searched him, they found a sling bag with various tools, ones commonly used for breaking into houses. He also had a hunting knife. It was clear what his real intentions were. There was never a reservation mix-up, just a lie to try and get inside. Had I not checked the door one last time before heading to bed, I might not even be here to tell this story. This happened a few years back during the colder months. I was working remotely as a customer support agent. That evening, I had a late shift from 4 p.m. until midnight. I headed up to my workspace, shut the door, and settled in at my desk. The first half of my shift was pretty routine and passed quickly. I took a short break for dinner and then got back to it. After that, things slowed down, and I mostly just sat there, staring at the empty screen, waiting for any requests to come through. Out of nowhere, I heard something behind me, a loud noise from somewhere in the house. I slipped off my headphones, glanced at the door, then walked over to open it and listen for any more sounds. But everything was silent. I figured it was nothing and didn't want to be away from my desk too long. So I left the door open and went back to work. I forgot about it soon enough since I didn't hear anything else. at least not over my headphones. For the next few hours, it was quiet. But then, around 11:30 p.m., just as I was about to finish my shift, another sound reached me. This one was softer but sent a wave of unease through me. It gave me a bad gut feeling, almost like a warning. I stood up from my chair and stepped into the hallway. The moment I looked down, a chill ran through me. The door at the end of the hall was wide open. That shouldn't have been possible. Frozen in place, I glanced toward the opposite end of the hallway. That's when I saw it. A shadow shifting on the wall. Someone was standing at the foot of the stairs. I could barely make out their shape, but they were there. Panic surged through me. I backed into my room, locking the door behind me, and grabbed my phone to call the police. My hands were shaking as I dialed, my breath coming in quick gasps. I kept my eyes fixed on the gap beneath the door, expecting any second to see movement, to hear footsteps coming closer. But none ever did. I didn't hear them climb the stairs. I didn't even hear them move around downstairs. When the officers arrived and checked the house, they found no one. No signs of forced entry. No clues as to how they had gotten in or why. What unsettled me the most was the realization that, at some point, they must have passed right by my open office door. They had probably seen me sitting there, unaware, headphones on. I don't know what their intentions were, and that's the part one still can't shake. So many unanswered questions. This happened in early February last year. Winter was still around, but the heavy snowfall and bitter cold had mostly faded. Most mornings, a thin layer of frost still coated the ground, but the days were warming up just enough for me to get back to my outdoor activities. Hiking, camping, cycling, and everything else I had put on pause for the past 3 months. That day, I drove out to a place I had visited the previous autumn. I liked it because it was far from town and rarely had visitors. Just a quiet spot to unwind and take in the scenery alone. I pulled off the road and hiked about 45 minutes to reach the campsite. It was just a small dirt clearing with a slight overlook of the forest below. I set up my things as the sun was already beginning to set. I always preferred arriving late, having a quick meal, and heading straight to sleep. After gathering some sticks for a small fire, I walked over to the overlook to watch the sunset. I had only been sitting there for a minute or so when I spotted a fire in the distance. It was down the hill, nestled among the trees, not far from where I was. What struck me as odd was that there was nothing else there. No tent, no chairs, and not a single person around. The fire was completely unattended. That wasn't just unsafe, it was strange. Fires don't sustain themselves indefinitely, so someone had to have lit it recently, only to abandon it. I figured they must be coming back soon, so I waited and watched. An hour passed. The sun had fully set, yet there was still no sign of anyone near the fire. What was even stranger was that the fire seemed to grow instead of dying down. It was as if someone had placed thick logs underneath to keep it burning bigger and longer, almost like a bonfire. That started making me uneasy, especially since I was so close. I decided to go down and check it out, and if nobody was around, I would put it out myself. It was only about a 2-minute walk to reach the spot, but since it was dark, I had to use my flashlight. As I got closer, everything was eerily quiet. The only sound was the crackling flames, flickering and whipping in the breeze. When I finally arrived, the fire was already raging, dangerously high, and still had more unburned logs stacked underneath. Who would do this? There was no way this was an accident. I began scooping up wet dirt and tossing it onto the flames. It worked well enough to bring the fire down, allowing me to reach in and pull out the larger unlit logs. It took me about 5 minutes, but eventually, I managed to put it out. Suddenly, the area was silent and engulfed in darkness. I switched my flashlight back on and started making my way up the hill. I no longer felt safe staying there, not with someone else lurking around. As I reached my campsite and began packing my things, I heard footsteps nearby. I turned to see a shadowy figure approaching. They were about 50 yards away, still concealed by the night. I stood up straight and called out, "Hey, did you light that fire?" The figure stopped but didn't respond. "Hello? I can see you." Can you just answer my question? I shouted again. No reply, just silence. A deep unease crept over me. I needed to leave immediately. I hurried to finish packing while keeping my eyes on them. They remained there, motionless, watching me. As soon as I had everything on my back, I started walking away. The person stayed put, watching me the entire time until I was out of sight. I reached my car and reported the incident to the authorities. To this day, I still don't know what was really happening out there. Who was that person? Were they trying to start a massive fire? Had they seen me arrive and set the fire to get my attention? I don't know, and thankfully I didn't stick around to find out. I work at a rundown bowling alley in my tiny hometown. It's one of those small, family-run places, not the nicest, but for some reason it was a popular hangout, maybe because it was one of the few spots open 24/7. At least it used to be. This happened in December. I was stuck with the dreaded overnight shift from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The place was usually dead at that time, and that night was even worse. A massive snowstorm had rolled in, and from the moment I clocked in and took over from the previous shift, not a single person showed up. After a couple of hours, I finished cleaning all but one lane, just in case anyone wandered in. Peeking outside, I saw the parking lot was completely empty, the snow piling up fast. It looked almost impossible for a car to even get through unless a plow came by. With nothing else to do, I grabbed a chair and sat by the window, watching the storm and resting. The place didn't have security cameras, let alone anyone monitoring them. So long breaks on slow nights, or even dozing off, wasn't hard to get away with. Maybe an hour later, a loud thump echoed from behind the bowling lanes. I was half asleep when it happened, but I jerked awake. My heart started pounding as I got up and walked toward the back area, having no idea what could have made that sound. Maybe it had something to do with the storm. The back room held all the pins, bowling balls, and machines that kept the place running. It stretched the full length of the building, a long, dark hallway. When I pushed open the door, everything was pitch black. At first, I didn't hear or see anything. Then I glanced down. There were wet footprints trailing down the hall. My stomach dropped. "Hello!" My voice came out shaky. "Is someone in here?" I stepped forward, calling out again, but got no answer. Then I spotted something taped to the wall. It was an envelope. Inside were Polaroid photos. Photos of me, working, alone. There were shots of me cleaning, walking around, and the most unsettling one, me sitting by the window. The angle was disturbingly close, like someone had been standing just a few feet behind me. I felt like I was going to throw up. Dropping the envelope, I bolted out of the hallway and straight to the front desk, frantically dialing 911. I tried to wait inside, but the silence of the building and the horrifying uncertainty of what was happening made my anxiety spiral. I ended up running to my car, locking the doors, and waiting there despite the raging snowstorm. The cops arrived surprisingly fast, maybe 2 or 3 minutes later, but whoever had been there was long gone. Of course, the crappy old place had no cameras, so there was nothing they could do. To this day, I have no idea who was stalking me or why. Was it a sick joke? Something worse? I never found out. Nothing else happened after that, but I still quit a couple of months later. I'm 22 and currently attending university. This happened about a month ago, right when winter was beginning. During our winter break, I spent most of my free time working for a food delivery app to earn some extra cash. That day, I had already done a few deliveries earlier, but later that night, I got bored and decided to head out for a few more. It was around 9 p.m. when I picked up a large order, 2 full bags of food, and started making my way to the address. It was in an area I had never been to before, taking me down a long, winding street lined with regular houses. Eventually, I reached the very back of the neighborhood, where it seemed like the road just ended. But according to my directions, I was supposed to keep going. As I got closer, my headlights revealed a small wooden gate with a number on it. It matched the address on my delivery, but it felt odd. None of the other houses had gates, and they all sat right along the street. This one, however, appeared to be at the end of a long private driveway. I got out to check the gate. It wasn't locked or anything, so I just pushed it open. Then, I got back into my car and drove down a wide gravel path, passing through some trees before finally arriving at a single house at the end. It looked noticeably older than the others, small, entirely wooden, and worn down. Still, the GPS confirmed this was the right place. I grabbed the bags and stepped out, leaving my car running so my headlights illuminated the front of the house. That's when I noticed something strange. None of the lights inside were on, not a single one, and yet the front door was wide open. As I reached the porch, the silence inside was unsettling. It seemed strange for someone to order so much food yet not even be downstairs to grab it. But that wasn't my problem. I started setting the bags down when suddenly, a voice called out from upstairs. "Hey, just bring it up here for me, man." There was a staircase right near the entrance, but it was so dark inside that I couldn't see the top. Without thinking, I took a couple of steps in. "Yeah, that's it. Just bring it up," the voice said again. It was coming from the very top of the stairs, in a patch of darkness where I couldn't see anything. The eerie silence in the house made my skin crawl. I hesitated, and something in my gut screamed at me to leave. I snapped out of it, turned around, and backed away fast. I dropped the food right on the porch and ran straight to my car. I had no idea what was going on in that house, but I didn't stick around to find out. I went home and didn't tell anyone. But a few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the address. Turns out no one was supposed to be living there. The property was abandoned, owned by the state. What was waiting for me at the top of those stairs? I don't know, and I hope I never find out.